How's it going? If this is your first time here, my name is Christian. I'm an ultra runner and a coach with Everyday Ultra. I'm also a connoisseur of energy drinks. Today I'm drinking a Bloom Sparkling Energy. It's raspberry lemon flavored because I have a long run after I record this video. So today we're talking long range plans. A long range plan is basically your overall structure for your entire training cycle. Today we're going to be talking specifically about training for a 100 miler, maybe your first 100 miler. So I will go into my long range plan, not my first 100 miler, but my long range plan. I will go into one of my athletes' long range plans and it's their first 100 miler. And then I have a couple others just to show you some different examples of what they could look like or the other types of things that you can add into them. It'll make more sense once I show you. So we'll just go into this Google Sheet as well as a little bit of Training Peaks and we'll talk through this. So this is my current long range plan. We're mostly just gonna be talking about this section right up here. You can see Rim to River 100. It's a race I'm going back to this year. All this other stuff, topic for another time. You can see Southern States 200. I'm running it in March. This is my best guess because I haven't run a 200. This is just coming from talking to some people who have run 200s before, but that's not the topic for today. Today we're talking hundreds. You can see that I have each of these like a few weeks at a time into different training blocks. And the difference between what this is, which is called block periodization, versus what a lot of people know as traditional periodization. They might use it for, marathon training or for a 10K, basically anything shorter than an ultra. Block periodization is meant to focus on one specific zone of training at a time. The reason that we do that is because if you just work, say, lactate threshold for a 4-week period, you're gonna get more out of that just working lactate threshold, doing, ideally 2 workouts a week, but if it's your first time, maybe just 1 workout a week within that specific zone, you're gonna get more out of it than you would if you do traditional periodization where you have a couple easy runs, but then you have a VO2 max workout and a lactate threshold workout and a long run all within the same week. It can be kind of hard to recover. You might not get as much out of, it's kind of like the whole jack of all trades, master of none kind of idea with traditional periodization. It does work great for marathon and sub-marathon stuff, but we're just talking ultras, and block periodization is ideally what you would be doing for your first 100 miler, especially if you work with someone on the Everyday Ultra team. So you can see here that I have the base building phase. The reason that I had this is I had some health stuff going on. Just coming back from that, I wanted to make sure my running base was built back up between 4 to 6 hours. After that, we have lactate threshold, the endurance / building our steady state stuff, and then we have our peak weeks here before our taper. So we're actually gonna work backwards from the race. I think this is the best way to do it. With a taper, the ideal taper period is between 10 and 14 days. So here I just have it blocked off as about 2 weeks, and that gives your body the opportunity to recover all those adaptations that you've been training for to finally sink in. There's another thing that we would do in here that I'll show you on the other athlete, my other athlete who's running their first 100 miler that we'll get into in just a minute. But tapering's great, gives you the opportunity to recover, catch up on sleep, because after a huge training block, it is definitely a nice to have. So before that, we have this says 9 peak weeks. That is actually incorrect. This is 6 peak weeks. The reason I had 9 on there is because as a general rule of thumb, training for a 100 miler, you want to have 9 hours of time on feet for your peak 6 weeks of training before the taper. Now, with UESCA, the certification that we kind of base all of our training off of, or our training philosophy off of at Everyday Ultra, it lumps in 100K races and 100 mile races and has 6 peak weeks for the 9 hours. But the difference of 62 miles and 100 miles is obviously quite a bit. So we prefer to have people at like 10 to 11 hours if possible. Yes, that's a lot of running for most people if you have a life and a family and those kinds of things. I will definitely say that ultra running takes up a lot of time if you want to get into it as a hobby or as a profession. But I will be targeting 11 hours because I'm an ultra running coach and I have the time to do this in my schedule, even though I have a 2-year-old. So 6 peak weeks. And before that, I actually have an endurance steady state block. So what is steady state? Well, we train off of RPE, or rate of perceived exertion at Everyday Ultra. So it's a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most intense, like an all-out sprint. Steady state is in the 4 to 5 range. It is actually the top end of your aerobic fitness. Some people categorize it as comfortably hard. And as we transition through these periods, I guess not including the base building, but from lactate threshold to steady state, we're actually going from more intense further out from the race. And as we get closer to the race, we're gonna get less and less intense as we build volume, because you don't need to be doing as much intensity as you get closer to an ultra marathon. Because if you are running at 6 to 7 RPE, which is your lactate threshold range, at the very beginning of a 100 miler, I don't know if you're gonna finish that 100 miler. That's why we wanna do our least specific training first, and then we work towards more specific training to the actual race day conditions as time goes on. Hence, all of the long, slow volume we get here in our 6 peak weeks. So during this endurance steady state part, the reason that I do this before the peak weeks is because when you're coming from our lactate threshold, where we're gonna have some more intensity and a little bit less volume, we need time to transition from lactate threshold to our peak weeks. And you're probably not going to be doing 9+ hours of volume during your lactate threshold phase, at least for most athletes. If you're more experienced, like I know the CEO and founder of Everyday Ultra, Joe Corcione, he just did Western States 100. He was probably doing much more than 9 hours a week during his lactate threshold phase. But during his peak weeks, he was doing 20+ hours of training for just his endurance phase. Very different structure for someone who's been running 8+ years of ultra marathons. If you're watching this video, you probably haven't been running 8+ years of ultra marathons. So the reason that we have this is basically just to make a smooth transition and not have to go from, say you're at 6 hours a week of time on feet during your lactate threshold, and then the next week you're supposed to just jump to 9 hours. It's not a healthy jump. You're probably gonna get injured. It's not good for anyone. That's why we have this transition period where we can deload some of the intensity while we increase some of the volume. Coming back another couple of weeks, we also have our lactate threshold. Your lactate threshold, it's basically the point at which your body can no longer process lactate fast enough to keep it from accumulating in your bloodstream. The point of raising your lactate threshold is to move that kind of ceiling so you can use more of the fitness that you've built up. We're not gonna really get into like super nitty gritty of what the lactate threshold is. I'll probably do that in a future video because my lactate threshold block is just starting today. So right now we're just gonna talk about the long range plan and the general overview. Just know that this is kind of more in your 6 to 7 RPE range. 8 to 9 would be VO2 max, which it's not on this long range plan, and I'll explain that in a minute. Again, like I said before, you're moving from least specific to most specific. This phase is more intense than steady state, so we're doing it earlier in the training block to build more of that top end fitness before just getting into a bunch of low, slow volume. And then for me, I don't know if I mentioned this before, I may have, but coming back from an injury, some health stuff. So I just wanted to build my base up to between 4 and 6 hours for a couple of weeks sustainably before getting into any sort of intensity here in the week of July 6th for my lactate threshold block. You can also see down here that I have a couple of deload weeks. These are just kind of possible deload weeks. You can loosely schedule them into your long range plan, but what I would recommend is anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks of building volume before a deload week. Yes, you should be taking deload weeks. This is where you allow your body to have some of those adaptations sink in. It's almost like a little mini taper that you would have right before a race. But if you're just nonstop building all the time, your body isn't having the opportunity to absorb all of that training well enough. So you need to give your body rest. The reason I put it here at the end of the lactate threshold block is because higher intensity, 3 weeks of building, followed by 1 deload week, which I'll probably still keep a lactate threshold workout in there because it's within that block, but just overall reduce volume, maybe shorter intervals during that those workouts. And then the reason I have a deload here is because the longest that you should build in general is about 6 weeks before having a deload. And because I know I'm going to be doing 6 weeks in a row of building high volume before the taper, I would like to have a deload before that because I don't want to, build for, let's just say, these 5 weeks and then have to have a deload right here, right in the middle of my peak training. If I absolutely have to, I will, because you don't want to get injured that close to the race. But in an ideal world, I would be able to build and maintain high volume for all 6 of these peak weeks. So that's a rough overview of what my long range plan looks like. Now I'll show you one of my athletes who she's training for her first 100 miler, and it's actually very close in date to this one, but there's a couple of different things happening within her training that dictates her having a different long range plan. So I'll kind of loosely talk about those. So let me zoom out here. So this is her long range plan, and you can see that we just started working together. So the date at the top is actually the same. and she's running Javelina 100 at the end of October. So it's only a week difference. Now, what you can see here is her training looks very similar to mine in that it's a taper, an endurance block, a little bit of a transition period between the lactate threshold and a base building. Some of the things that are different about hers is that her base building period is actually 2 weeks shorter than mine. She's coming off of a marathon, you know, some minor stuff going on post-marathon, but nothing super serious. So we're able to just get straight into a shorter period of base building before getting into the lactate threshold. I believe, now we have the same amount of time in the lactate threshold. Another big thing is you can see here that I have reach and maintain 9+ hours of volume, 10 to 11 preferred. I mentioned that I'm going to be shooting for 11 plus weeks. I'm going to be shooting for 11+ hours of time on feet during my endurance block, but I've run 100 miles before and I was able to maintain around 9 hours per week. And that was before I was a coach and was able to do this full time. So to me, I will be able to have more volume because my life is kind of now centered around this stuff, as well as a little bit of that, like, I like to think of it as lifetime miles. Because I've done this before, your body is a little bit more prone to adapting well to it, in my opinion. So yes, I would love to have her up in the 10, 11 hour range of time on feet, but if at 9 hours she starts to feel burnt out a little bit more frequently or can't show up the way she needs to in the other places of her life, getting to that 9 hours of time on feet per week is still a great marker for success. Now, the other thing you'll notice, other than the fact that I took the time to actually put some of this information in her long range plan, is that during the taper I have heat training. This is always a big question for athletes, especially if they're gonna be running a hot race. But the brief overview of heat training is, no, you probably should not be doing it year round. There's definitely professionals and people all over Instagram that will tell you you should be doing heat training year round. But for, I won't say a regular athlete, because that, I feel like that has a little bit of a negative connotation, but for someone who hasn't built fitness for 15+ years running, you will get more out of just running more than you will out of heat training every day for your entire training block. All that's gonna do is it's going to add a little bit too much stimulus for most people, and you're not gonna get as much out of your training. So for someone like me who's been running for a couple of years, yes, I could heat train all the time, but it would be better if I could just run an extra like 2 to 3 hours per week. I'm gonna build more fitness that way versus the kind of more marginal gains I'll get from heat training. Also, heat training is something that has to constantly be done to maintain the benefits. 7 to 10 days of initial heat training, like in a row consistently, to get the benefits, and then to maintain it, you have to heat train once every 2 to 3 days. Otherwise, you lose a lot of those benefits very quickly within, you know, just like 2 to 4 days or something like that. So that's the big thing on here for her, is Javelina 100 is very consistently a hot race. Even on cool years, it is still a hot race. Anything over about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll start to see performance degradations. So if your race is gonna be in the middle of the summer, or it's just gonna be hot because it's early fall, something like that, then just know that heat training could be really great for you, assuming that you're going into the taper not completely fried and burnt out. So again, not really too much dramatically different for her long range plan than mine, but I will say that week to week, the training will absolutely be different, even though our long range plans look very similar. I'll very quickly jump over here to my training peaks and show you kind of what this week looks like for me. You know, I have a little note for myself that the lactate threshold block is starting. I'm doing a total of about 7 hours of time on feet across 6 runs. My long run is a little bit shorter this week just because I've been kind of rebuilding that back up. The more important workout for this week is actually my lactate threshold workout, where I have my intervals right here. For her, right now, I think I have her on 5 days a week of running. She just has some other obligations. It's a little bit harder to get in that 6th day as she transitions to coaching together. That's why training will look different, even though the long range plan may look very similar. And again, I've run 100 miles before, so I kind of have a better picture, or a more clear picture, of what my peak training can look like in terms of time on feet and how durable I am. Whereas with her, she's never built up to volume that high before. So we're gonna be a little bit more careful, making sure she gets to the start line healthy rather than overcooking her and then running into a lot of problems throughout the training block. So those 2 long range plans were very similar. Now I'm gonna show you one that's very different from those, which is my first long range plan from when I was working with our CEO and podcast host, Joe Corcione at Everyday Ultra. He was my first running coach before coming on as a coach myself. So the biggest thing you'll see that's different about this is it's not just this 20-week period up here or this extra 20-week period here, but it's actually 62 weeks of training. 62 weeks for one training cycle. This is where you can really see block periodization looking very different than traditional periodization. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but if you are the kind of person who likes to be over-prepared, that, you know, I really was going into my first 100 miler, is I found a series of races that included a 50K, a 100K, and a 100 miler. And I figured if I worked with a coach for the entire training cycle, I would get the biggest benefit across all three races and make sure I got to the start line healthy for my first 100 miler. So nothing different about this, the 2-week taper, but you can see that because I had so much fitness built up, I was able to have a much longer endurance cycle. How many weeks is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 weeks, a 10-week peak cycle. And I actually still had a lactate threshold block and a kind of transition endurance to lactate threshold block before that. And then something we didn't really talk about on either of the previous two long range plans is a VO2 max block. We'll get into that in just a second. But first I want to kind of go back and show you, here we go, back to the beginning. So I was coming off an injury. I didn't know what I was doing. I immediately got myself hurt when I got into running ultras, but such is life. So we did some aerobic conditioning, some base building, added in some strides, and then we hit our first VO2 max block. And this VO2 max block goes across these 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 weeks, which it was oh my gosh. And 7 weeks for VO2 max felt so absurdly long. At the time, I didn't realize I was having some of the health issues that I had to get sorted out. I could build for about 2 weeks before I needed to deload. I was just fried all the time, especially doing 2 workouts a week. VO2 max stuff is hard. Now, and then I had the 50K. So I did a bit of a recovery kind of taper period. I think this was a slightly smaller one. I think I did it more towards the 10-day side rather than the 14. And then coming out of that, because the A race for this entire year of working was the 100 miler, we didn't do VO2 max, lactate threshold, and endurance prior to each race. Basically, I had this really long VO2 max section, and then I had this very long lactate threshold section before the 100K, and then I did all of them again prior to the 100 miler. So you can see I have, again, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, probably like 8-week lactate threshold block before mini taper again and doing falling water 100K. A bit of a recovery period, which I think this ended up stretching about 2 weeks because that was my first 100K and I was cooked. And then after that, we continued to build volume and then we went back into another VO2 max phase. I think what ended up happening in reality was we cut this one a little bit short because I was so burnt out after the 100K that rolling straight back into really high intensity was just absolutely wrecking me. I don't think I was getting much fitness. I think I was really just digging myself a really big hole. So something to be very careful of. But then I went back into another lactate threshold, a little mini lactate threshold section before this FKT attempt that I ended up DNFing and my big endurance block. And so what did all, 60 weeks of training get me here at Rim to River? A DNF. I ended up DNFing due to some lung issues, but the training went phenomenal. I PR'd, I think, my marathon, my 100K, and my 50 miler within this 100 miler before having some issues that were not at all related to leg durability. It was just one of those things that it wasn't my day, had some problems with my lungs, fluid building up. But the story has a happy ending because I believe it was this week right here, week 66, I went and ran another 100 miler because I was like, my legs are still good. They have enough fuel in them. My legs were not the reason I had to DNF, so I want to end the year on a high note. And I did finish that 100 miler, and it was the most grueling experience of my life. I do not recommend doing that, but live and learn. So the last one that I want to go into is a sample athlete that I made just to show a little bit of what it would look like if you had a VO2 max phase in here. And just to kind of show again that it's the same process of going from the least specific, which is VO2 max, down to the most specific, which is the endurance block. So again, 3 to 4 weeks of this VO2 max phase. This is for a 20-week build. I think that this is kind of more of the ideal range of time to train for a first 100 miler. And also keep in mind that this is someone that would already be at a solid base because we're just rolling straight into VO2 max here. So I think maybe 24 weeks is actually the best for most people if you're not already running that 4 to 6 hours per week. If I was working with an athlete who said that they were already running 4 to 6 hours a week, what I'd probably do is I would have 1 week where I just have them train normally and I analyze what they're already doing to make sure that, you know, we're speaking the same language here. And then I would roll into about a 3-week VO2 max period, and that could get us our 20 weeks of training prior to race day. Or if they need that base building period, then 24 weeks. I think that's kind of the sweet spot for me. Yes, you can do more and you do get longer periods, longer blocks within this block periodization, but it really just depends on your goal. If you're just trying to get to your first 100-mile start line healthy and you want to just finish the race, you're not too concerned about, you know, setting an age group time or a course record somewhere, then I think this is like a pretty solid build for most people. Now, granted, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes here because your training may look very different. A lot of people have, you know, their own lives and schedules and problems that they may be running into, whether it's injuries or there's a million different things that can go wrong. But this is how I would generally structure it if you were making your first long range plan for your first 100-miler. So obligatory, if you don't want to do this yourself, reach out to one of us at Everyday Ultra, even if it's not me. If you don't like me and you think I'm a ridiculous individual, we have like 19 or 20 other coaches on our staff that maybe one of them would be a better fit for you. I'll leave the link in the description if you want to check out some of the other coaches. I think my stuff is kind of towards the bottom since I'm one of the newer coaches on the team, but I digress. And if this video does well, and I don't know, I think I'm at like 300 subs or something like that on YouTube, I'm gonna try to start posting more consistently here. So if I get over 350 subs within like the next 2 weeks of this video being posted, I'll drink this entire Precision Fuel and Hydration 300-gram flow gel and immediately give myself diarrhea. I'll post it on Instagram. So I'm just kind of curious if I can do that, honestly. Because the most I've ever done is 120 grams per hour during a marathon. So can I do 300 grams in 1 hour and go on an easy run? We'll find out. So thanks for sticking around. Let me know if you have any other topics you want to get into. I will probably just kind of have you follow along with my training, which means the next video will likely be something about lactate threshold. But until then, I will see you next time.